Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we uncover the hidden facts of Skyrim's most powerful force, the voice. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next. And subscribe if this helps you sleep. Iceform's hidden vulnerability window. Iceform doesn't just freeze enemies in place. There's a precise 0.5 second window immediately after the ice shatters, where the target takes triple damage from all sources. This vulnerability window is so brief that most players never notice it, but speedrunners exploit it religiously. The game calculates this as a state transition penalty, reality needing a moment to remember that the frozen target is supposed to have normal defensive properties again. During this microsecond of confusion, every attack connects as if striking completely unarmored flesh. Fire-based attacks during this window deal even more damage because the target's body temperature is still registering as frozen, creating a thermal shock multiplier. Ancient Nordic warriors who mastered Iceform would coordinate attacks specifically around this vulnerability window. One tongue freezing enemies while others waited with weapons raised, striking the instant ice shattered. The saga technique was called Glacier Strike and turned Iceform from a crowd control tool into an execution method. Modern players occasionally stumble into this accidentally, wondering why that one power attack somehow one-shot a frost troll, never realizing they'd perfectly timed the strike to exploit Iceform's hidden damage window. Become Ethereal's momentum preservation. Become Ethereal has a strange interaction with physics that makes it invaluable for movement exploits. When you activate the shout, the game preserves your current momentum vector, but stops calculating full damage or impact trauma. This means you can sprint off a cliff, activate Become Ethereal mid-fall, and hit the ground at terminal velocity without taking any damage. But here's the part most players miss. Your momentum doesn't just continue, it compounds. If you're falling and use Whirlwind Sprint while ethereal, the sprint's velocity adds to your fall velocity, creating combined momentum that launches you forward at impossible speeds when you land. Speedrunners call this ghost launching and use it to traverse entire map sections in seconds. The technique works because Become Ethereal removes your collision with damaged surfaces, but not with movement surfaces, so you can still run and jump while intangible. Some players have discovered that repeatedly jumping while ethereal and falling generates a bounce stack effect, each jump adding fractional velocity that accumulates into massive horizontal distance when the shout ends. The world record for longest jump in Skyrim uses this exploit, combining Become Ethereal with careful momentum management to leap from the throat of the world to Whiterun in a single continuous arc. Aura Whisper's true detection range. Aura Whisper claims to reveal life forces through walls, but its actual detection works on a principle most players never understand. The shout doesn't detect life. It detects consciousness, which is why it highlights people and animals, but ignores plants despite them being technically alive. More interestingly, Aura Whisper can detect entities that are programmed as aware, even if they're not currently loaded into the active game world. This creates the bizarre situation where sometimes you'll see red auras through walls in dungeons, marking enemies that are technically in sleep mode, their AI not yet activated because you're too far away. The shout essentially preloads enemy positions, giving you intel on encounters the game hasn't actually spawned yet. This is why Aura Whisper sometimes shows enemies teleport when you get closer. They weren't moving, They were transitioning from preloaded data state to active AI state. The detection range is also affected by line-of-sight calculations in strange ways. Aura Whisper can see through multiple walls, but struggles with certain types of magical barriers, not because those barriers block the shout, but because they're programmed as consciousness dampeners in the game's logic. Vampires show up differently than humans under Aura Whisper. Their auras pulsing with a darker red that indicates their undead status. Though this detail is so subtle, most players never consciously notice the distinction. Fire Breath's lingering damage. Fire Breath applies a damage over time effect that most players understand, but what they don't realize is that multiple applications stack in non-intuitive ways. If you hit the same target with Fire Breath repeatedly, you're not just refreshing the burn duration, you're creating layered burn effects that calculate damage independently. The game tracks up to 5 separate burn instances simultaneously, each one ticking for damage on slightly offset timers. This means a target hit by 5 rapid fire breaths isn't taking 5x damage per second, they're taking damage 5 times per second, with each tick calculated separately and potentially multiplied by different factors like elemental weaknesses or armor penetration. This stacking becomes absurd against enemies with fire vulnerability. A frost troll hit by 3 fire breaths in quick succession takes exponentially more damage than the tooltip suggests, because each burn layer multiplies against their weakness independently. The mechanic also interacts strangely with other fire sources. If you fire breath an enemy and then hit them with a fire spell, the spell's burning effect becomes its own layer, stacking with the shout's layers. Theoretically, you could apply dozens of simultaneous burning effects to a single target, though the practical limitations of cooldowns and combat pacing make this difficult to achieve. Speedrunners who fight Alduin sometimes use rapid fire breath stacking combined with fire potions to create truly ridiculous DPS numbers, each burn layer compounding until Alduin's health bar evaporates in seconds. Dragonren's metaphysical weight. Dragonren forces dragons to land, but the mechanism is far stranger than a simple grounding effect. The shout temporarily makes dragons subject to mortality, and mortality in Skyrim's physics engine has weight. Specifically, it adds gravitational mass proportional to the target's level and health pool. When you Dragonrend a dragon, you're not pulling them down, you're making them suddenly too heavy to fly. Their immortal weightlessness replaced by mortal density. This is why higher level dragons crash harder when dragon-rended. They have more life force that gets converted into physical mass. The effect also explains why dragon-rend dragons sometimes damage themselves on landing. They're experiencing sudden onset of mass they didn't have moments before, and the impact trauma calculates based on that new mass hitting the ground at their current velocity. Essentially, you're turning dragons into falling meteors with their own body weight. The shout's effect lingers briefly, even after dragons recover and take flight again, making them fly slightly slower for a few seconds as reality gradually forgets they were mortal and allows them to return to their normal, weightless, immortal state. Ancient Nords who developed Dragonren understood this principle instinctively. They weren't just grounding dragons, they were teaching them the crushing burden of finite existence, using mortality itself as a weapon. Throw Voice's AI manipulation code. Throw Voice is often dismissed as a novelty shout, but it's actually exploiting fundamental AI pathfinding in ways that break enemy behavior patterns. When you use Throw Voice, you're not creating a sound at the target location. You're creating a false interest point in the game's AI detection system. Enemies don't hear something. Their AI receives a signal that there's a priority investigation target at those coordinates. This distinction matters because interest points override normal patrol patterns and aggression states in specific ways. An enemy chasing you will completely forget about you and investigate the throw voice location, their aggro state resetting to neutral during the investigation. This means you can use throw voice mid-combat to essentially make enemies forget they were fighting you, turning active combat into a stealth situation. The shout also has maximum range limitations that aren't obvious from the targeting reticle. If you aim throw voice at a location too far from any enemy's current position, it generates the interest point, but no enemy will ever investigate because it falls outside their awareness radius. However, if you place it just inside that radius, you can lure enemies from extreme distances, far beyond their normal detection range. Stealth players have discovered that throw voice can be chained to create breadcrumb trails, a series of interest points that guide enemies along specific paths, useful for luring patrols away from their routes or separating grouped enemies. The shout's cooldown is short enough that you can maintain near constant AI manipulation if you're patient, essentially puppeting enemy movement through their own investigation behaviors. Elemental Fury's attack speed. Elemental Fury doesn't just make you swing faster, it manipulates the game's animation speed in ways that create unintended consequences. The shout applies a global animation speed multiplier to your character, which affects weapon swings as advertised, but also affects everything else your character does. Drinking potions becomes faster, lockpicking is accelerated, even dialogue animations with NPCs speed up if you're still under Elemental Fury's effect when initiating conversation. The most exploitable aspect is how it interacts with dual wielding. When dual wielding, each hand calculates its animation speed independently, and Elemental Fury applies its multiplier to both hands separately. This means the DPS increase isn't proportional, it's exponential. You're not attacking 30% faster with each hand. You're attacking 30% faster with each hand, and the hands are synchronizing differently, creating overlap where damage from both weapons registers almost simultaneously. The theoretical damage output ceiling becomes absurd. The shout also has bizarre interactions with certain enchanted weapons. Weapons with chance on hit enchantments trigger their effects based on animation completion, not damage dealt. Elemental Fury makes those animations complete faster, which means you're rolling for enchantment effects more frequently per unit time. A weapon with 10% chance to paralyze becomes dramatically more effective under Elemental Fury, because you're getting 3 or 4 chances to trigger that effect in the time it would normally take for one swing. Enchantments with cooldowns don't benefit the same way, but percentage-based proc enchantments essentially multiply their effective chance by whatever your animation speed multiplier is. Summon Durnavir's Persistence. Summon Durnavir has a unique bug that's actually useful rather than detrimental. If you summon Durnavir and then immediately fast travel before he fully materializes, his summon timer stops counting down. He remains summoned indefinitely, flying around whatever location you fast travel to, participating in combat without time limit. The game tracks summon duration by checking how long since the summon was cast, but fast travel during the summoning animation confuses this check, making the game think Durnavir was never actually summoned, even though he's clearly present and functional. This creates a persistent dragon ally that follows you between locations until you manually dismiss him by leaving the area's boundary or entering an interior cell. Players have discovered that you can maintain permanent Durnavir by carefully managing travel patterns, essentially having a dragon companion throughout your adventures. The bug also stacks in weird ways. If you trigger it multiple times, you can theoretically have several Durnavirs active simultaneously, though the game's dragon spawning limitations usually prevent more than 2 from existing at once. The duplicate Durnavirs are fully functional, fighting alongside each other and responding to combat separately. This wasn't intended behavior, but it's been left in the game across multiple patches and versions, suggesting the developers either don't consider it worth fixing or appreciate players finding creative uses for shouts. Durnavir himself seems to acknowledge this weirdness. If you manage to get multiple versions of him active, his dialogue sometimes references echoes of the Soul Cairn, as if explaining why he's duplicated. Kind's Peace's aggression, reset. Kind's Peace makes animals non-hostile, but it's actually performing a complete aggression state reset on affected creatures. This means it doesn't just calm them temporarily, it makes the game forget they were ever hostile in the first place. Animals affected by Kind's Peace won't become hostile again unless you directly attack them or enter combat with something else in their immediate vicinity. This creates weird scenarios where you can use Kind's Peace on a bear, walk right past it, and then watch it attack other NPCs while completely ignoring you. The game has tagged you as permanent non-threat to that specific creature instance. The effect persists through save, R-load cycles, and fast travel, meaning a bear you pacified in one location might remember you're not a threat if you encounter it again later, though this is inconsistent and depends on whether the game spawned a new bear instance or reloaded the existing one. The shout also has unintended interactions with were-creature transformations. If you use Kind's Peace while in beast form and then revert to human form, some animals will remain pacified toward your human form, their AI having associated both forms as the same non-threatening entity. This can create hilarious situations where you're a werewolf hunter who's accidentally made every wolf in Skyrim friendly through repeated transformations and Kind's Peace usage. The shout's effect even extends to creature followers and summons in strange ways. Animals pacified by Kind's Peace sometimes become temporarily non-hostile to your summoned creatures, treating your Frost Atronach as if it were part of the natural environment rather than a magical construct. Stormcall's friendly fire mechanics. Stormcall is one of the only shouts with genuine friendly fire risk, but how it targets victims is more complex than random lightning strikes. The shout generates a pool of potential strike locations every few seconds, weighted toward areas with high NPC density. It then filters those potential strikes through faction allegiance checks, attempting to avoid hitting allies, but with success rates that vary based on how chaotic the combat situation is. In practice, this means Stormcall's lightning prefers to hit enemies, but if enemies and allies are clustered together, the faction filtering sometimes fails, and lightning strikes whatever target is closest to the calculated impact point, regardless of allegiance. The failure rate increases with the number of active combatants. Stormcall is relatively safe in one-on-one fights, but becomes increasingly dangerous to allies in large battles. What most players never realize is that Stormcall can be aimed by moving to specific positions relative to enemies. The shout calculates potential strike locations in a radius around your position when cast, then continues using that radius center as reference even after you move. If you cast Stormcall while standing in the middle of an enemy group and then immediately retreat, the lightning will preferentially strike the area where you were standing, hitting enemies that moved into that zone. Strategic players can essentially paint target zones for lightning by positioning carefully when casting. The shout also has different weather-dependent power levels that aren't documented anywhere. Storm Call cast during existing storms deals more damage and strikes more frequently because it's amplifying natural weather rather than creating artificial storms. Conversely, casting it during clear weather makes it slightly weaker and slower to activate. The difference is subtle but measurable, and completionist players who track DPS optimization swear by only using Storm Call when weather conditions are favorable. The voice that shapes reality. There's something deeply mesmerizing about the way shouts ripple through Skyrim's frozen air, the way they bend reality with nothing more than spoken word and ancient intention. The Thu'um isn't simply magic dressed in draconic syllables. It's older than that, stranger than that. It existed before the concept of spellcasting was even imagined by mortal minds. When you Fusroda a bandit off a cliff, you're not casting a spell through magic and manipulation. You're speaking reality itself into a new shape, commanding the very fabric of existence to obey patterns encoded in words that predate civilization. The dragons didn't invent this power. They are this power, their very essence woven from the same cosmic threads that allow the Thu'um to function. Every time you shout, you're touching something that remembers the world's beginning, something that whispers through dimensions of thought and being that mortals weren't meant to perceive. The Thu'um predates the divines, predates even the Atada, existing in that strange space before creation fully solidified into its current form. Some theorists believe the voice is what gave shape to chaos during the Dawn era, the tool through which Akatosh himself imposed order on the screaming void. When dragons speak, they're not translating thoughts into words. They're thinking in the fundamental language of existence, and their thoughts become manifest because that's what those particular vibrations do to the underlying structure of Nirn. The Dragonborn inherits this capability not through study, but through soul-deep recognition, their spirit remembering how to speak in tones that reality must answer. This is why shouts feel different from magic, why they bypass traditional spell resistance, why they can affect things that shouldn't be possible to influence. You're not imposing your will through mystical energy. You're stating facts to a universe that still remembers when those facts were the only language spoken. Words before words. The dragons call their language Dovazul, though that translation carries implications that don't quite capture the full meaning. It's not a language they created or developed. It's a language they are, the vibrations that comprise their essential nature given form through sound. When a dragon speaks, it's not choosing words from a vocabulary. It's allowing its inner truth to resonate outward, and the universe recognizes those resonances as commands it cannot refuse. This is why dragon names are so important, so potentially devastating when spoken with proper understanding. A dragon's name is its entire existence compressed into syllables, every aspect of its being encoded in specific sounds. To speak a dragon's name with full comprehension is to define that dragon, to pin its infinite possibility down into one particular configuration of reality. The ancient Dragonren shout works on this principle, forcing dragons to comprehend mortality, not through persuasion, but through definitional imposition. The 3 words of Dragonrend essentially redefine what it means to be dragon within the affected area, temporarily overwriting their immortal nature with the concept of finite existence. It's not that they become mortal, it's that reality forgets they're immortal for the duration of the shout's effect. and they fall because the universe no longer remembers how to support their impossible existence. This is deeply traumatic for dragons, not because it hurts them physically, but because it forces them to experience non-existence at an existential level. For creatures that are essentially living concepts given flesh, having their concept temporarily deleted is the closest thing to true death they can experience. The Thu'um operates entirely on this level of metaphysical programming. Each shout, a string of code rewriting reality's operating system in real time. The first voices, long before Nords learned to shout, before Paarthurnax defected from Alduin's tyranny, before the Dragon War scarred Skyrim's mountains with blood and ash, there were others who understood the voice. The texts don't speak of them clearly, these pre-human users of the Thu'um, but evidence of their existence lingers in places scholars rarely look. Certain word walls appear far older than the Dragon War, worn not by time, but by something else. Their inscriptions faded in ways that suggest they were deliberately obscured rather than naturally eroded. These ancient walls sometimes teach words in a dialect of Dovazul that dragons themselves don't recognize, variations that predate even draconic language as the dragons remember it. Some theorists propose these walls were created by the Akaviri Dragon Guard, but the timeline doesn't align properly. The Akaviri came to Tamriel specifically to hunt dragons, already understanding their language, already knowing how to combat them. Where did they learn this knowledge? Who taught them to speak in words older than the dragons they hunted? The Greybeards maintain silence on this topic, their tradition requiring them not to speak of certain histories, though their eyes carry recognition when questions approach these forbidden territories. Paarthurnax himself becomes oddly evasive when discussing the deep origins of the voice, deflecting questions with philosophical musings rather than historical facts. He knows something, remembers something from before the rebellion, something about where the Thu'um came from and why dragons could speak it instinctively while other creatures required decades of meditation to master even a single word. Perhaps the answer lies with the Hist, whose connection to all things linguistic remains mysteriously deep, or with the Dwemer, who understood tonal architecture in ways that parallel the voice's reality-shaping capabilities. Maybe the Thu'um was never created at all, never had a first speaker, but has always existed as the underlying syntax of existence. And dragons simply happen to be the first creatures with the cognitive architecture to perceive and articulate it naturally. The tongue's hidden grammar. Every shout follows a pattern, a three-word structure that most users never question. But this isn't arbitrary. The three-word composition reflects fundamental aspects of how reality processes commands, each word serving a specific grammatical function in the language of existence. The first word typically establishes context, defining what aspect of reality is about to be modified. The second word introduces the modification itself, the change being imposed. The third word provides scope and power, determining how far and how intensely the change ripples through the world. Fusrodar perfectly demonstrates this structure. Fus means force, establishing that we're working with kinetic energy and physical motion. Ro means balance, introducing the concept of disruption, the breaking of equilibrium. Da means push, providing direction and scope, turning abstract concepts into directed action. Together, they form a complete sentence in reality's language, a command so fundamental that existence itself cannot ignore it. But here's where things get interesting. Not all shouts require all three words. You can speak fuss alone or fuss row, and the shout still functions, though with reduced effect. This isn't because you're speaking it weakly. It's because you're speaking incomplete sentences, grammatical fragments that reality can still pass, but which don't carry the full semantic weight of the complete thought. Some shouts seem to violate this three-word rule, like storm call or summon Durnevere, which use different grammatical structures entirely. Storm call's words, Strunbar call, actually translate to storm wrath lighting, creating a sentence that functions more as evocation than command, calling forth an entity rather than modifying existing reality. This suggests that Thuum operates with multiple grammatical moods, different sentence structures for different types of reality manipulation. Commands, requests, evocations, definitions, each requires its own linguistic approach, and the dragons understood all these variations instinctively. The soul's resonance. The absorption of dragon souls is perhaps the most mysterious aspect of the Dragonborn's power, something even the dragons themselves don't fully understand. When you slay a dragon and absorb its essence, what exactly is happening? The visible effect shows soul energy flowing from the corpse into the Dragonborn, but that visual representation is merely mortal perception, attempting to comprehend something that occurs outside normal space-time. Dragon souls don't exist within the dragon's body the way mortal souls do. They're distributed across multiple planes of existence simultaneously, anchored to physical form but extending into realms of pure concept and thought. When a dragon dies, its soul doesn't leave its body. The body stops being able to contain the soul's full dimensional presence, and it begins collapsing back toward its origin point, which happens to be Akatosh himself, or perhaps Akatusk, or one of the other dragon god fragments that comprise the divine of time. The Dragonborn intercepts this collapse, essentially catching the soul mid-transit between physical manifestation and divine reabsorption. But here's the crucial detail that most people miss. You're not really absorbing the entire dragon soul. You're absorbing the knowledge encoded within it, the portion of the dragon's existence that understood how to speak certain aspects of reality. The dragon itself, its personality and memories and essential being, that continues on its original trajectory back to whatever cosmic source spawned it. What you gain is purely linguistic knowledge, patterns of thought and speech that let you articulate reality the way that specific dragon did. This is why absorbing souls allows you to unlock shouts you've learned from word walls. The wall gave you the conceptual framework, the theoretical understanding of the words, but you need the practical experience of a being who actually used those words, who shaped reality with them, to fully comprehend how to make them work. Different dragons have different specialties, different aspects of the voice they've mastered over their millennia-long existences. Some dragons are better at offensive shouts, others at defensive, still others at utility or transportation. When you absorb a dragon's soul, you're essentially reading their dissertation on a particular aspect of reality programming. And sometimes you learn things they never consciously knew they understood. The physics of thunder, unrelenting force, Fus Ro Da, remains the most iconic shout in Skyrim. but very few users understand what it's actually doing to targets. The common interpretation suggests it's generating a wave of kinetic force, pushing things backward through sheer physical pressure. But if that were true, the shout should affect everything equally based on mass and surface area. Instead, we see strange inconsistencies. A lightweight basket might remain completely undisturbed, while a heavily armored warrior goes flying. Why? Because Fus Ro Da doesn't push objects. It breaks their connection to stability, temporarily severing the metaphysical bonds that anchor them to their current position in space. For a fraction of a second, the shout tells reality to forget that the target has mass, inertia, and resistance to motion. In that moment of forgotten physicality, even the slightest existing momentum sends them flying, which is why shouting at someone who's already moving backward sends them much farther than shouting at someone standing still. The basket doesn't move because it has no existing momentum to amplify, no internal force waiting to be unleashed. This also explains why Fus Ro Da can affect ghosts and other incorporeal entities. It's not pushing their physical form because they don't have one. It's disrupting their existential anchoring, the metaphysical connection that allows them to maintain coherent presence in our plane of reality. For a moment, they lose their grip on existence itself, and the natural drift between planes carries them away from you. The same principle applies to why the shout can blow doors off hinges or knock items off shelves. It's not the force that does it. It's the temporary cessation of all the tiny forces holding things in place, the friction and weight and mechanical resistance that keeps doors closed and items stable. Remove those forces for just an instant, and everything moves toward its lowest energy state, which for a door means hanging open, and for a plate means falling off the shelf. Whispers in stone. Word walls hold more secrets than the words they teach. Their construction involves techniques lost even to the most skilled mages of the Fourth Era, methods that allowed ancient craftsmen to bind conceptual knowledge directly into stone in ways that could survive millennia without degradation. Each wall is essentially a solid-state storage device for reality-altering information, but encoded in a format that requires specific preparation to access. The dragons carved these walls, yes, but not with claws or magic. They spoke them into existence, using aspects of the Thu'um that aren't meant for combat or utility, but for creation and preservation. There's a shout for making word walls, a specific combination of words that most dragons knew, but which was never passed to mortal tongues. It roughly translates to "stone remembers speaking," and it does exactly what it sounds like, imbuing rock with the capacity to hold and transmit linguistic knowledge. The dragons used this after their defeat, creating a distributed network of teaching tools that would preserve their language even if all dragons were slain. It was a backup plan, a way to ensure the Thu'um wouldn't be completely lost to time. But here's what makes these walls truly remarkable. They don't just contain the words they teach. They contain echoes of the dragon who created them, fragments of consciousness and personality encoded alongside the linguistic data. When you approach a word wall and hear that otherworldly chorus, when the words seem to sing themselves into your understanding, you're not reading an inscription. You're experiencing a limited form of communication with a long-dead dragon who created that specific wall. For Dragonborn, this process is almost instantaneous. the knowledge transferring so quickly it feels like sudden remembrance. For normal practitioners of the voice like the greybeards, approaching a word wall without proper preparation would be overwhelming, possibly fatal, as centuries of compressed dragon thought attempted to force itself into a mind not structured to receive it. This is why the greybeards meditate for years before learning even one word. They're not learning to speak the word. They're learning to structure their consciousness in a way that can safely interface with the information encoded in the walls. The silence between words. One of the most overlooked aspects of the Thum is what happens between shouts. Those moments when reality settles back into its normal configuration after being temporarily redefined. The cool-down period isn't arbitrary game mechanics. It represents something fundamental about how the voice interacts with the world. When you shout, you're forcing reality to acknowledge a contradiction, making it accept conditions that shouldn't logically be possible. Gravity doesn't work that way, but your shout makes it work that way anyway. Matter doesn't behave like that, but you've overridden its behavioral rules through sheer linguistic force. This creates what scholars call a stability debt, a period where reality needs to reassert its normal parameters to remember how things are supposed to function. If you tried to shout again immediately, before the previous shout's effects had fully dissipated, you'd be attempting to layer contradictions on top of contradictions, potentially creating cascading instabilities in the local fabric of reality. The results could range from the shout simply failing to work to catastrophic reality breakdown in the immediate area. Dragons understand this intuitively, feeling the world's resistance to rapid successive shouts. The Dragonborn, being part mortal, doesn't feel this quite as clearly, but their dragon soul still enforces the weight, preventing them from shouting again until the metaphysical ripples have calmed. However, certain amulets and blessings that reduce shout cooldown aren't actually letting you shout faster. They're helping reality stabilize more quickly by providing ambient order energy that speeds up the return to baseline conditions. The Amulet of Talos, for instance, doesn't enhance your voice. It lends you a fragment of Talos's divine nature, and divinity inherently stabilizes reality around itself, allowing the contradictions of your shouts to resolve more rapidly. This is also why repeated shouting in the same area can start to feel different. Why that 50th Fusro Da at Bleak Falls Barrow seems slightly weaker than the first. The local reality has been stressed so many times that it's developing what amounts to scar tissue, becoming more resistant to your attempts to rewrite it. Dragon names, dragon souls. The practice of speaking a dragon's name carries far more weight than most realize. Dragons rarely share their true names, the full draconic appellations that define their entire existence, because to know a dragon's true name is to hold power over their fundamental nature. The dragons you fight in Skyrim, names like Saluknir and Vintruth and Nahagliv, those aren't their true names. They're use names, titles and epithets the dragons adopted for interaction with lesser beings. Their real names exist in a version of Dervahzul so ancient and complex that most mortals couldn't even pronounce the syllables properly, let alone comprehend their full meaning. When ancient dragon priests summoned dragons, they didn't use these names either. They used something else, binding phrases that referenced the dragon's nature without fully defining it, like calling someone by their job title instead of their personal name. But those who did learn a dragon's true name held terrifying power. They could compel obedience through specific phrasings, could even unmake the dragon entirely by speaking their name backward, or in certain forbidden dialects, or with particular tonal variations. This is why Mirak was so dangerous. He'd learned to perceive true names, to hear them in the way dragons moved and spoke and thought. He could look at a dragon and simply know its real designation, and with that knowledge, he could bind them to his service or destroy them with a single spoken word. When the Dragonborn shouts at a dragon, you're not intimidating it with noise or damaging it with sound. You're asserting dominance in the draconic hierarchy by demonstrating your right to speak their language with the fluency and power that marks you as their equal or superior. Some dragons, the more intelligent ones like Parthenax, respond to this by offering respect or alliance. Others, driven by pride or Alduin's lingering influence, respond with fury and intensified aggression. But in both cases, they're acknowledging you as something more than mortal prey, recognizing in your voice the echo of their own divine nature. The rare dragons who speak to you during combat are actually trying to learn your true name, listening to the linguistic signatures embedded in your shouts, hoping to discover the words that define your essential being so they might gain leverage in the confrontation. The Greybeard paradox. The Greybeards live under an oath of silence so profound that even casual conversation could prove catastrophic. Their voices grown so powerful through decades of meditation that ordinary speech carries the weight of minor shouts. But this raises interesting questions about the nature of power and restraint within the voice. Why does practice make the Thu'um more dangerous rather than more controlled? For normal magic, additional training typically grants finer precision and better command over one's abilities. With the voice, it seems the opposite occurs. The more you understand, the harder it becomes to speak without invoking that understanding, without letting your words carry the weight of deeper meaning. This suggests that Thu'um isn't really something you control. You're simply learning to be a clearer channel for its expression, removing the barriers between your intent and reality's response. A greybeard who's meditated for 40 years doesn't have a stronger voice than a novice. They have a more transparent voice, their words carrying less personal distortion, allowing the fundamental reality-shaping power to flow through them with greater clarity. This is why they can't speak normally. Their transparency has become so perfect that even saying hello might carry unintended force, their greeting striking with physical impact because the universe hears it not as a simple greeting, but as a statement of fact about the other person's state of being. They've learned to mean exactly what they say with such precision that reality can no longer ignore their words as mere social conventions. Master Arngir, who occasionally speaks to the Dragonborn, maintains enough opacity to converse safely, but even he must be careful, choosing his words with extraordinary precision, ensuring each syllable carries only the meaning he intends and nothing more. The rest of the Greybeards have passed beyond even this limited capability, their understanding so complete that they exist in a state approaching pure voice, barely mortal anymore, held to physical form only through constant meditation and willpower. When they shout together at your approach to Higher Hrothgar, they're not attacking you. They're testing whether your dragon soul can withstand direct exposure to what amounts to undiluted linguistic reality, determining if you can survive learning from them without being unmade by the experience. Words of power. Across dimensions. One rarely discussed aspect of the Thu'um is how it functions across different planes of existence. When you shout in Sovngarde, does it work the same way as shouting in Nirn? The answer reveals fascinating implications about the voice's fundamental nature. In Sovngarde, your shouts feel slightly different, not weaker or stronger, but less constrained, as if reality in that realm responds more readily to linguistic commands. This makes sense when you consider that Sovngarde is essentially a constructed reality, shaped and maintained by Shor and the ancient Nord heroes. It's less fixed than Nirn, more willing to accept alternative configurations, so the voice encounters less resistance when attempting to modify conditions there. This explains why fighting Alduin in Sovngarde feels different from fighting dragons in Skyrim. He's not stronger in his native realm. You're both stronger, your shouts carrying more weight. The battle operating at an elevated level of metaphysical intensity. In the Soul Cairn, however, the opposite occurs. Your voice becomes muted, dulled, struggling to find purchase in a realm so thoroughly dominated by death and emptiness. The ideal masters have structured that dimension specifically to resist change, to maintain eternal stasis, and the Thu'um, which is fundamentally about imposing change, finds few anchor points to work with. You can still shout there, but it requires more effort, and the effects dissipate more quickly, reality in the Soul Cairn returning to its default dead state almost immediately. Apocrypha presents yet another variation. In Hermaeus Mora's realm, knowledge is the fundamental substrate of reality, and the voice, being itself a form of knowledge about reality's structure, interfaces with that realm in unique ways. Shouting in Apocrypha doesn't just affect physical conditions, it affects the conceptual landscape, temporarily rewriting the rules that govern that particular corner of infinite knowledge. Some have theorized that the Thu'um could function even in oblivion, though it would need to be spoken in dialect specific to each prince's realm, adapting to the alien physics and metaphysical rules that govern those spaces. The lost shouts. History records only a fraction of the shouts that once existed. During the height of dragon civilization, dozens of word walls dotted Atmora and northern Tamriel, teaching Thu'um combinations that modern practitioners have never heard of. Many were lost during the Dragon War, when humans deliberately destroyed walls to prevent dragon forces from teaching new shouts to their servants. Others vanished with Atmora itself when that continent succumbed to whatever mysterious catastrophe rendered it uninhabitable. The Greybeards maintain fragmentary records of these lost shouts, preserved through oral tradition and carefully guarded text. Some of them sound beneficial, like Halivir, Hand Mirror, which supposedly allowed the user to perfectly replicate any physical action they'd seen performed, enabling instant mastery of combat techniques or crafting methods. Others sound utterly terrifying, like Molfenkol Blind, which allegedly erased the target's memory of warmth, making them forget what heat felt like so thoroughly that they froze to death even in summer sunshine. The dragons themselves remember many lost shouts, but most refuse to teach them to mortals, considering them too dangerous or too fundamentally draconic for human minds to safely comprehend. Paarthurnax hints at shouts that could unmake cities, shouts that could turn stone to water or reverse time within a localized area, or force the stars themselves to reorganize in the sky. He speaks of these as hypothetical examples, but his tone suggests lived memory rather than philosophical speculation. Some scholars believe certain shouts were deliberately hidden, not destroyed but encrypted, transformed into codes that require specific other shouts to decrypt and understand. The theory goes that powerful dragons, knowing their civilization would fall, created linguistic locks, hiding their most dangerous knowledge in plain sight within seemingly harmless words or non-functional word combinations that would only reveal their true power when spoken in specific sequences or contexts. If this is true, there might be word walls in Skyrim right now, teaching shouts that appear useless or broken, but which would function perfectly if only we knew the proper preparation, the key phrases that would unlock their full potential. The dark tongues. Not all shouts were used for noble purposes. The dragon priests in particular developed variations of the Thu'um, specifically designed to dominate, control, and terrorize their subjects. They couldn't learn new words from dragons. Their masters taught them sparingly, so they experimented with corrupting existing shouts, warping their meanings through will and intent until the words did things they were never meant to do. Some of these corrupted shouts still linger in forgotten tombs, carved into walls that the dragons themselves refuse to acknowledge, teaching dark variations that twist the voice into something predatory and wrong. One such shout, whispered about in greybeard oral tradition, but never explicitly described, was called Zika, soul seize, which allowed dragon priests to pull living souls partially out of their bodies, leaving victims conscious but paralyzed, aware but unable to control their own flesh. Priests used this to maintain order through terror, demonstrating their absolute power over life and death, showing that they could remove your very existence from your body with just a few spoken words. The shout was supposedly lost when the dragon priest Azidal, in a moment of remorse late in his life, destroyed every word wall teaching it and killed every priest who'd learned it, considering the shout too cruel even for his standards. But rumor persists that Azidal carved one final wall teaching Zika in his tomb, hidden where only someone of extraordinary skill and determination could find it, preserving the technique just in case someday it might be needed for some purpose he couldn't foresee. Another dark shout, Kethuri, bone break, did exactly what it sounds like, causing catastrophic skeletal failure in anyone struck by the voice, their bones spontaneously fracturing under the stress of reality, forgetting how to properly structure calcium. Dragon priests use this as public execution method, the victim's screams serving as warning to any who might consider rebellion. The more philosophical question these dark shouts raise is whether the Thu'um itself is neutral, capable of expressing any intent without moral judgment, or whether there's something inherently degrading about forcing the voice to serve cruel purposes, whether using Dovazul for evil inevitably corrupts both the words and the speaker. The meditative voice. Beyond combat and utility, the Thu'um has applications in meditation and spiritual development that most warriors never explore. The Greybeards spend most of their time not learning new shouts, but exploring the infinite depths of the words they already know, discovering that each word contains worlds within worlds of meaning and nuance. Take Fus, for example. Most users understand it as force, a simple kinetic concept. But through deep meditation, one can perceive additional layers. Fuse also means persistence, the force of continuing to exist despite opposition. It means impact, the moment when one thing affects another. It means change, the force that transforms stable situations into fluid ones. Each layer of meaning opens new ways to use the word, new applications that don't necessarily manifest as louder or more powerful shouts, but as more precisely targeted ones. A master who's meditated on Fus for decades could, theoretically, use it to affect things on a molecular level, forcing individual grains of sand to scatter or blood cells to flow differently in someone's veins, all through perceiving the deeper harmonics of what force really means at the fundamental level of existence. This meditative approach to the voice explains why the greybeards seem so calm and centered, despite possessing power that could level mountains. They've learned that the Thu'um isn't really a weapon. It's a lens, a way of perceiving and interacting with the fundamental nature of reality. The more you use it as a bludgeon, the blunter your understanding becomes, until eventually you're just making noise. But those who approach it with patience and introspection discover that the voice can be as gentle as it is forceful, as healing as it is harmful, as illuminating as it is destructive. There are stories, unverified but persistent, of greybeards using the Thu'um to accelerate their own healing, to calm storms through pure meditative focus, even to communicate across vast distances by speaking so softly that only the intended recipient's soul could hear, the words bypassing physical space entirely to resonate directly in another person's consciousness. The Dragonborn Legacy. Being Dragonborn isn't merely about possessing a dragon soul. It's about existing in a state of permanent linguistic contradiction. Being simultaneously mortal and draconic, temporary and eternal, limited and boundless. This paradoxical nature is what allows the Dragonborn to use the Thu'um without decades of meditation. Their dragon soul providing instinctive understanding, while their mortal perspective offers the creativity and adaptability that dragons often lack. Dragons approach the voice with eons of experience, but also with fossilized patterns of thinking, their ancient minds following well-worn grooves that make innovation difficult. The Dragonborn, barely having understood the voice for more than a few years, brings fresh perspective, finding novel applications and combinations that hadn't occurred to beings who've been shouting since the Dawn era. This is why Miraak was so dangerous, and why each Dragonborn represents a unique threat and opportunity. They're wild cards in the cosmic order, beings whose very existence rewrites rules about what's possible with the voice. Some Dragonborn throughout history have pushed their powers in strange directions. The tales speak of one who learned to shout so quietly that nobody around them even realized they'd spoken, the words affecting reality directly without passing through sound at all. Another supposedly developed a version of fire breath that burned only lies, leaving truth unharmed, allowing them to discern deception through selective destruction. Whether these stories are factual or mythologized beyond recognition remains unclear, but they point to a consistent theme. Each Dragonborn discovers their own unique expression of the voice, shaped by their personality, experiences, and understanding of what the Thu'um fundamentally represents. Your Dragonborn is no exception. The way you use shouts, the combinations you favor, the moments you choose to shout or remain silent, all of these define your personal relationship with the voice, creating a linguistic signature that's uniquely yours, a dialect of reality that only you speak with quite that particular accent and emphasis. And when your soul eventually returns to whatever cosmic recycling center processes Dragonborn after death, it will carry those innovations with it, potentially influencing how future Dragonborn unconsciously approach their power. Shout synergies. The most experienced users of the voice understand that shouts don't exist in isolation. They interact with each other in complex ways, creating emergent effects that aren't explicitly programmed into any individual shout. For instance, using slow time while another shout is propagating through the air creates fascinating distortions, the voice rippling in compressed waves that amplify in strange patterns, sometimes doubling effects or extending durations far beyond their normal parameters. Fire breath combined with storm call produces something that's neither quite fire nor quite lightning, but a hybrid phenomenon. Flames that arc through the air seeking targets, or electrical discharges that burn with intense heat. The game's engine simplifies most of these interactions, but the lore suggests far more complexity. Ancient Nordic tongues reportedly developed techniques called shout weaving, speaking multiple shouts simultaneously by splitting their awareness, part of their mind focusing on one shout, while another part spoke a second, the two voices harmonizing in ways that created entirely new effects. This required extraordinary mental discipline and resulted in what witnesses described as reality stuttering, the immediate area flickering between different states as competing commands tried to assert themselves simultaneously. The Greybeards know these techniques exist, but consider them far too dangerous to teach. The risk of catastrophic failure too high when compared to the marginal benefit gained. If you lose control while attempting to speak two shouts at once, the contradictory commands can create what amounts to a linguistic singularity, a point where reality literally doesn't know what to do, resulting in explosions, dimensional tears, or worse, persistent zones where cause and effect no longer function properly. There are supposedly ruins in abandoned corners of Abmora, where ancient tongues attempted shout weaving and failed, leaving behind areas where time flows backward, or gravity points sideways, or sounds become visible as colorful geometric shapes. The Dwemer were fascinated by these phenomenon, believing shout-weaving failures could be studied to better understand tonal architecture, but their research notes on the subject are fragmentary and often contradictory, suggesting they never fully cracked the code of how intentional voice usage related to their more abstract tonal manipulations. The tonal connection. Speaking of which, the relationship between the Thu'um and Dwemer tonal architecture remains one of the most debated topics among scholars who study reality-altering forces. Both systems manipulate existence through sound and resonance. Both require deep understanding of fundamental patterns, and both can produce similar effects despite approaching from different philosophical angles. The Dwemer would argue that the Thu'um is primitive, a brute force approach that achieves through linguistic command what tonal architecture accomplishes through mathematical precision. They'd say shouting at reality to change is crude compared to composing symphonies of exactly calculated tones that naturally encourage reality to shift in desired directions. But the tongues would counter that mathematics is just another language, one far more limited than Dovazul, capable only of describing relationships and quantities while failing to capture the qualitative, conceptual nature that the voice expresses effortlessly. The truth likely lies somewhere between. Both systems are valid approaches to the same underlying truth, that reality responds to properly structured information. Whether that information is presented as draconic commands or as precisely toned vibrations. Some researchers have proposed that a synthesis of the two approaches might achieve effects neither could produce alone, using shouts to establish conceptual frameworks, while using tonal architecture to fine-tune the specific parameters. If anyone ever accomplished this, the results haven't been recorded, though certain unexplained phenomena in Dwemer ruins suggest someone might have tried. There are rooms in Blackreach where shouting produces visible tonal patterns in the air, geometric light forms that weren't there before you spoke, as if the ancient machinery is still trying to analyze and replicate the voice, attempting to decode Dovazul into mathematical relationships it can understand and work with. Whether this is intentional design or emergent behavior from damaged systems remains unclear, but it hints at deeper connections between these two approaches to reality manipulation than most surface-level examinations would suggest. Storm Call's secret. Storm Call stands apart from other shouts in several important ways. It's one of the only shouts that doesn't produce immediate effects where you're standing, but instead summons a broader phenomenon that affects a wide area over extended duration. This difference isn't just mechanical. It reflects something fundamental about how the shout interfaces with reality. Stormcall doesn't create weather. It calls weather, inviting existing atmospheric potential to manifest and concentrate in a specific location. The Thu'um essentially asks the sky if it's interested in making a storm, and the sky, being comprised of elemental forces that respond to properly phrased requests, agrees to rearrange itself accordingly. This is why Stormcall takes a moment to activate. You're not seeing processing lag. You're seeing negotiation, the shout, and the atmosphere reaching agreement about what's about to happen. It's also why the storm continues after you stop shouting. You've convinced the weather to behave a certain way, and weather, once convinced, maintains its course through momentum and natural patterns. The storm doesn't need you to keep it going any more than a rolling boulder needs you to keep pushing once it's moving. Different regions respond to Stormcall differently. In East March, where thunderstorms are common, the shout manifests almost instantly, pulling together atmospheric conditions that were already predisposed towards storm formation. In the Reach, where weather patterns are more stable, the shout takes longer and produces less intense results, the atmosphere more resistant to your linguistic persuasion. This regional variation hints at something deeper, that different locations have different levels of responsiveness to the voice, perhaps related to historical usage, dragon presence, or other factors that have acclimated the local reality to understanding and responding to Dovazul. Ancient texts mention tongues who specialized in Stormcall, spending years learning, not just the words, but the weather patterns, understanding atmospheric science through draconic perspectives. These specialists could supposedly call forth specific types of storms, choosing lightning strikes over rain, or hail over snow, or even creating what observers described as inside-out storms, where the wind blew from all directions toward a central point, rather than swirling in traditional patterns. The secret shout. Deep in Skyrim's programming and lore exists a shout that almost nobody talks about, partially because it's not easily accessible during normal gameplay, and partially because its implications are deeply uncomfortable. Marked for death, Cree Lun Aus, serves as this shout's most commonly known version, but ancient texts reference a more extreme variant called simply mortality. 3 words that roughly translate to certainty end final. This lost shout didn't just weaken targets, it imposed death upon them conceptually, telling reality that the target is dead, and reality being obligated to agree with properly spoken Dovazul would make that truth manifest regardless of the target's actual physical condition. Imagine shouting at someone and having them simply stop existing, not exploding or disintegrating, but just ceasing, as if they'd never been there at all. This ultimate expression of marked for death was supposedly what ancient tongues used during the Dragon War's darkest days, when every available weapon needed deployment against impossible odds. The shout worked even on dragons, at least temporarily, though their essential nature as immortal beings meant they'd eventually reconstitute. But the temporary removal from existence bought crucial time in battles that couldn't otherwise be won. The ethical implications of such a shout are staggering. You're not killing someone in the traditional sense. You're retroactively erasing them from reality's memory, at least temporarily. After the Dragon War, when tensions between tongues and common Nords grew into violence, this shout was specifically targeted for suppression, all references destroyed, all word walls teaching it buried or demolished. The Greybeards maintain absolute silence about it, refusing to even acknowledge that such a shout might have existed. Some theorizes the shout is too dangerous to destroy completely, because the knowledge of how to speak it might be needed again someday, so it remains hidden in a secret word wall somewhere, perhaps in Atmora, or deep in some unexplored corner of Skyrim, where only someone worthy and desperate enough could find it. Others argue that the shout was fiction from the start, propaganda meant to terrify dragon forces, but the way the Greybeards won't discuss it suggests otherwise. The throat of the world. High Hrothgar sits partway up the throat of the world, but the mountain's summit holds significance beyond being the tallest point in Skyrim. The name itself, Throat of the World, hints at the location's importance to the voice. This is supposedly where Kain first taught humans to shout, where the barrier between mortal and draconic understanding grew thin enough for knowledge to pass through. The summit's metaphysical properties make it one of the strongest anchor points for the voice in all of Tamriel, a place where shouts work more easily and more powerfully than anywhere else. When you fight Alduin at the throat of the world, you're not just choosing that location for dramatic effect, it's strategically crucial. The summit's nature as a focal point for the voice means your shouts have enhanced effectiveness there, while Alduin, despite his power, is somewhat constrained. The mountain's essence remembering Kain's gift to mortals and subtly resisting the World Eater's attempts to assert dominance. This is why the Greybeards built their monastery at this location, rather than in some more comfortable valley. They're not just studying the voice, they're living as close to its terrestrial origin, point as mortal bodies can survive, allowing them to maintain constant connection with whatever metaphysical forces first made the Thu'um possible for human tongues. The mountain itself responds to the voice more readily than normal terrain. Shouting at the throat of the world produces visible distortions, ripples in the air that suggest something deeper than sound is propagating through the summit's rock and ice. Some have reported that if you listen carefully between shouts, you can hear faint echoes of ancient Thu'um still reverberating through the mountain, the stone itself having absorbed and held onto fragments of every shout ever spoken at that location. These echo shouts can't affect anything, but they create an almost musical background, a constant low-level chorus of draconic words spoken by tongues who died millennia ago, their voices preserved in crystalline structures within the rock. Paarthurnax undoubtedly hears these echoes constantly, surrounded by the linguistic ghosts of his former students and the dragons he once commanded, a perpetual reminder of everything the voice has been used for throughout history. The voice in combat. Tactical application of shouts in combat situations reveals depths that casual usage never exposes. Beyond the obvious offensive and defensive utilities, the voice can establish psychological dominance, create environmental advantages, and even communicate complex ideas to allies mid-battle. Ancient Nordic war bands developed what they called battle speech, coordinated shout usage designed not just to damage enemies, but to reshape the entire battlefield's narrative. One warrior might use disarm, while another used fear. The combined effect not just creating a disarmed, frightened enemy, but establishing a psychological pattern of helplessness that could spread through enemy ranks faster than any spell. Another would use ice form on one target, while a third used unrelenting force on another, demonstrating the attacker's ability to either petrify or obliterate at will, forcing enemies into impossible decision paralysis about whether to stand still or move. This level of coordinated voice usage required intimate familiarity between warriors, the ability to anticipate each other's intentions and complement each other's shouts without verbal communication. Some historical accounts describe battle pairs who fought together so long that they developed what amounted to a private language of shouts, subtle variations in pronunciation and emphasis that carried tactical meaning only their partner could interpret. They could communicate entire combat strategies through careful modulation of their voice, disguising commands as attacks, the actual damage dealt being almost secondary to the information being transmitted. Modern warriors rarely achieve this level of sophistication, most treating shouts as isolated abilities rather than elements of a larger communication system. But the Dragonborn, with their instinctive understanding of Dovazul, could theoretically develop similar capabilities if they chose to fight alongside other voice users regularly. The challenge is finding partners who understand the nuance, who can perceive the communicative aspects of the Thu'um beyond its reality-altering effects. Dragons do this naturally, their combat often involving layers of meaning that mortal observers interpret as simple roaring, but which actually constitute complex tactical discussions happening at speeds thought can barely follow. Bend-Will's implications. The Bend-Will shout, learned during the Dragonborn questline, represents something uniquely disturbing about the voice's capabilities. It doesn't persuade or convince. It overwrites free will entirely, temporarily redefining the target's motivations so that serving you becomes their most fundamental drive. This isn't mind control in the traditional sense. Mind control implies an external force compelling action against the target's desires. Bend will is worse. It temporarily makes serving you the target's genuine desire, editing their consciousness so they legitimately want to do what you tell them. When the effect wears off, they remember choosing to serve you, remember wanting to obey, which creates deep psychological trauma as they try to reconcile their actions with their actual values and personality. Using bend will on dragons is particularly problematic. Dragons are essentially immortal beings with memories stretching back millennia. When you bend will a dragon, you're imposing your authority over thousands of years of lived experience, forcing a being older than civilization to temporarily forget its own autonomy. The dragon remembers this afterward, remembers being reduced to a puppet, and for a creature whose entire identity is built on personal power and dominance, this experience is profoundly damaging. Some dragons who've been bend-willed multiple times show signs of what might be called psychological scarring, becoming more aggressive or more submissive depending on their personality, but always changed by the violation of having their will overridden. Mirak's use of bend will to build his dragon army wasn't just tactically effective. It was psychological warfare of the most intimate kind, demonstrating to every dragon that their vaunted immortality and power meant nothing against someone who could simply delete their autonomy with 3 words. The ethical questions around this shout are significant. Is it ever justified to completely override someone's free will? What about in situations where they're an immediate threat to innocent lives? What about dragons who've committed atrocities? The Greybeards would argue that any shout which removes agency is inherently evil, that the voice should respect consciousness even in enemies. But practitioners with more pragmatic philosophies might suggest that bend will, used carefully, could prevent greater harm than it causes. The question remains unresolved, and the Dragonborn, as the only mortal with reliable access to this shout, effectively becomes the arbiter of when, if ever, complete mental override is acceptable. The dragon aspect, the shout that temporarily transforms the user into something approaching draconic form, operates on principles that blur the line between physical and metaphysical change. When you speak those words and feel your body begin to shift, what's actually happening? You're not shape-shifting in the traditional sense. The shout doesn't change your flesh into scales or grow you wings. Instead, it's redefining what you are conceptually, telling reality that for the next few moments, you are dragon, and reality adjusts your capabilities accordingly to match that redefinition. Your body produces armor-like protrusions, not because tissue is restructuring, but because the universe now understands you as something that should have armored hide, and it fills in that understanding with visual manifestation. You become stronger not through muscle growth, but through existential reclassification, reality treating you as dragon-sized, even though your physical dimensions haven't changed. This is why the shout feels so different from other transformations. There's a sense of rightness to it, as if you've remembered something you'd forgotten about your own nature, which makes sense given that Dragonborn already are part dragon. Dragon aspect simply makes that hidden nature visible and functionally dominant for a brief period. Some theorists suggest that extended use of dragon aspect could make the transformation increasingly permanent, each use leaving behind traces of draconic essence that accumulate over time until the distinction between dragon and mortal becomes meaninglessly blurred. Whether this is desirable or terrifying depends largely on the individual's relationship with their draconic nature, but it raises questions about the Dragonborn's long-term fate. Will you eventually become more dragon than human? Your mortal aspect slowly worn away by repeated assertion of draconic identity? The ancient Dragonborn, whose knowledge allowed you to learn dragon aspect, must have considered these possibilities. Perhaps they embraced gradual transformation into something more than human, or perhaps they used the shout sparingly specifically to avoid crossing that threshold. The spectral ancient Dragonborn who appear when you fully unlock dragon aspect suggest the former, their ghostly forms distinctly more draconic than mortal, as if they'd pushed so far into dragon identity that even death couldn't fully restore their human nature. Words of power, words of identity. Each shout you learn changes you in subtle ways, encoding its understanding into your being so thoroughly that it becomes part of your identity. This isn't metaphorical. Learning a word of power literally restructures aspects of your consciousness, creating neural pathways or soul pathways, or whatever metaphysical architecture allows the knowledge to persist. Someone who's mastered unrelenting force doesn't just know how to shout things away from them. They carry understanding of force and motion and physical impact at a level that influences how they perceive and interact with the world. A master of Stormcall begins to notice weather patterns they'd previously overlooked. Their consciousness expanded to include meteorological awareness as a natural sense, rather than learned knowledge. This gradual accumulation of understanding is why the Greybeard seems so alien, so removed from normal human concerns. They've internalized so many layers of meaning from so many words that their perception of reality has been fundamentally restructured. They don't see the world the way normal people do. They see it as a linguistic construct, all phenomena reducible to combinations of draconic concepts, everything explainable through sufficient mastery of Dovazul. This gives them incredible insight into the nature of existence, but also isolates them socially, their minds having diverged too far from typical human consciousness for easy communication. The Dragonborn experiences an accelerated version of this transformation, each absorbed dragon soul carrying not just specific shout knowledge, but broader conceptual frameworks that expand and alter perception. By the time you've defeated Alduin and absorbed dozens of dragon souls, you've been exposed to multiple draconic perspectives on reality, each one slightly different, each one adding new layers to your understanding. This probably explains why the Dragonborn often feels restless, constantly seeking new challenges and adventures. You're being pulled in multiple directions by competing draconic instincts and philosophies embedded in all those absorbed souls, each one subtly influencing your motivations and interests in ways you might not consciously recognize. You're not quite yourself anymore, if you ever were. You're a coalition of perspectives held together by mortal willpower and dragon soul, a walking compromise between human values and draconic imperatives. The unlearnable shouts. Some shouts simply cannot be learned through normal means, requiring conditions so specific or dangerous that even attempting to create a word wall for them would be irresponsible. Dragon Ren serves as the primary example. A shout so specifically designed to hurt dragons that it contains conceptual contradictions dragons themselves cannot safely speak. When you learn Dragon Ren from the ancient heroes in Sovngarde, you're not learning from a word wall. You're receiving direct knowledge transfer from souls who understood mortality so deeply that they managed to weaponize that understanding against beings who've never experienced death. This method of teaching, soul-to-soul knowledge transfer, works only for the Dragonborn, and only in realms like Sovngarde, where the barriers between consciousness are permeable enough to allow direct information flow. Other unlearnable shouts exist primarily in legend. There are references to shouts that could only be spoken once, the act of speaking them consuming some essential quality of the speaker's being, making second use impossible because you're no longer the same person who first spoke those words. These single-use shouts supposedly achieved effects of cosmic significance. Reality changes so profound that they couldn't be repeated without unraveling existence itself. One story describes a tongue who, cornered by an entire dragon flight, spoke a shout that essentially said, "This never happened," retroactively erasing the last hour of time from reality's memory. The tongue survived, but they were the only person who remembered the battle. Everyone else experiencing sudden discontinuity as time skipped forward without the erased events having occurred. The tongue couldn't explain what had happened because there was no longer any evidence that anything had happened, and the shout itself was gone from their knowledge, consumed by the act of reshaping history. Whether these stories are factual or allegorical remains debatable, but they point to a consistent theme in voice lore, that the Thuum's full potential extends far beyond what safely reproducible shouts can demonstrate, into territories where cause and effect become negotiable, and where speaking the wrong words could unmake not just yourself, but the very foundations of consensual reality. Clear skies, darker implications. Clear skies seems benign, almost pleasant, a shout that brings good weather and helps visibility. But deeper examination reveals troubling aspects of what this shout actually does. It doesn't gently disperse clouds or encourage natural weather patterns toward fair conditions. It forces weather to cease, imposing stillness on atmospheric systems that have their own momentum and logic. This is violence, albeit subtle violence, against natural processes. The clouds don't want to disappear. The wind doesn't want to stop. The shout compels them, overriding their nature through linguistic dominance. From a certain perspective, every use of clear skies is an assault on the sky itself, a forcing of will where invitation might have been more appropriate. This philosophical concern might seem overwrought until you consider the accumulated effects. Using clear skies repeatedly in the same region could theoretically damage local weather patterns, creating subtle instabilities that manifest as unpredictable storms or unexpected droughts months later. The atmosphere has memory, patterns of behavior encoded in thermal gradients and moisture distributions, and constantly forcing it to clear might disrupt those patterns in ways that produce unintended consequences. The greybeards rarely use clear skies specifically because of these concerns, preferring to let weather follow its natural course unless absolutely necessary to intervene. When they do use it, they reportedly spend time afterward in meditation, essentially apologizing to the sky, trying to restore balanced relationship with atmospheric forces they've just dominated. This might sound absurd to pragmatic users who just want to see where they're going, but it reflects deep understanding of the voice's nature. Every shout is an imposition, an assertion of your will over reality's preferences, and even benign-seeming shouts carry ethical weight that shouldn't be dismissed. Kine, goddess of the sky and storm, supposedly taught humans the voice, but one wonders how she feels about that gift being used to suppress the very atmospheric phenomena she embodies and governs. Perhaps clear skies is a test, a way to see whether mortals can use power responsibly, or whether they'll casually override nature whenever slightly inconvenient. The dragon language paradox. Dovazul presents linguists with fascinating problems. It's simultaneously one of the oldest languages in Tamriel and one that continues to evolve and generate new words. Dragons don't create their language consciously, yet new draconic words appear throughout history, describing concepts that didn't exist when dragons first learned to speak. How can an instinctive language that dragons are, rather than learn, continue to develop vocabulary for modern concepts? One theory suggests Dovazul isn't really a language at all, but rather a perceptual framework, a way of organizing and expressing experience that happens to be translatable into spoken sounds. Dragons don't speak words. They emit patterns of meaning, and mortal minds interpret those patterns as words because language is how we process complex information. From this perspective, Dovazul isn't fixed or finite. It's infinitely generative, capable of producing new terms for new concepts as soon as any dragon thinks about those concepts with sufficient clarity. This would explain how ancient dragons can discuss modern ideas without awkward circumlocution. They're not translating from draconic to common and back. They're expressing meaning directly, and that meaning gets coded into whatever linguistic forms are most appropriate for the context. But this creates problems for word walls, which are definitionally fixed. The words carved into stone unable to update with linguistic evolution. This suggests word walls don't actually contain language in the traditional sense. They contain meaning patterns that manifest as language when interpreted by consciousness equipped to understand them. You're not reading words off a wall. You're experiencing a consciousness direct meaning transfer that your brain translates into verbal comprehension as the closest approximation to what you're actually receiving. This might explain why different people occasionally report learning slightly different versions of the same word from the same wall. They're not misremembering. They're interpreting the same meaning pattern through different experiential frameworks, resulting in subtly different linguistic expressions of the same fundamental concept. Dragons watching this process must find it endlessly fascinating and frustrating, seeing mortals struggle to articulate in linear language what dragons express as holistic conceptual packages. Fire breath's nature. When you use fire breath, what exactly are you creating? The visible flames seem straightforward, but analysis of the shout's effects reveals strange properties. The fire doesn't spread to flammable materials the way normal fire would. It doesn't consume oxygen or generate smoke proportional to its apparent heat. It damages living creatures but often leaves their clothing and equipment intact. This suggests that fire breath doesn't create fire in the chemical combustion sense. It's creating something that looks and feels like fire to affected targets, but which is actually a conceptual construct, a reality edit that tells the target they're burning without requiring actual oxidation reactions. From the target's perspective, the distinction is meaningless. They feel heat, they take damage, their health decreases. But from a metaphysical standpoint, this has profound implications. You're not generating energy from nothing, which would violate thermodynamics. You're convincing local reality to behave as if energy had been generated, to apply damage and heat effects without the usual causal chain that produces those effects. The flames you see aren't photons from actual combustion. They're visual metaphors, reality's way of representing the concept of burning in a form mortal perception can process. Dragons produce real fire when they breathe, their internal biology somehow generating chemical flames through processes scholars still don't fully understand. But when they use the fire breath shout, they're doing something different, speaking fire into existence rather than metabolically producing it. The distinction might seem academic, but it matters for defenses and counters. Fire resistance that works against chemical flames might not work against fire breath, because you're not actually being burned. Reality is being told you're burned, and unless your fire resistance functions at the conceptual level, it won't protect you from that redefinition. This is why some enemies seem inconsistently vulnerable to fire breath, their resistance or weakness depending on whether they're protected against actual fire or protected against the concept of burning. The meditation of violence. The Greybeards teach that the voice should be used only for worship and meditation, that using it for violence perverts its essential nature. But is this philosophical stance justified by the Thu'um's actual properties, or is it cultural bias elevated to metaphysical principle? Arguments exist on both sides. The pacifist position holds that Dovazul is fundamentally the language of creation and understanding, that it functions best when used to comprehend and harmonize with reality rather than to dominate and control it. From this view, combat shouts are degraded applications of the voice, like using precision surgical instruments as weapons. They work, yes, but they're doing violence not just to targets, but to the essential purpose of the tool being misused. The Greybeards point to the ancient Nordic tongues as cautionary examples, warriors who mastered the voice's destructive applications but lost sight of its deeper meanings, becoming little more than magical artillery, powerful but disconnected from the philosophical insights the Thu'um was meant to convey. The pragmatic counter-argument suggests that reality itself is neither peaceful nor violent, that the voice simply is, a tool without inherent moral alignment, capable of expressing any intention the speaker holds. Combat shouts aren't perversions of Dovazul. They're valid expressions of legitimate aspects of existence, destruction and protection, and force being as real and necessary as creation and understanding and harmony. From this perspective, refusing to use the voice in combat isn't ethical superiority. It's squeamishness, an unwillingness to engage with the full spectrum of reality's nature. The Dragonborn, learning from both Greybeards and dragons, occupies an interesting middle position. You can use combat shouts while still respecting the voice's deeper nature, treating each shout not as casual ability, but as significant act, meaningful engagement with reality structure. Perhaps the answer isn't that combat shouts are wrong, but that they shouldn't be used lightly, that every shout should carry weight and intention, rather than being deployed thoughtlessly. Violence with understanding might be more ethical than pacifism without comprehension. The voice across cultures, while Nordic culture and dragon civilization form the primary context for understanding the Thu'um, fragments of evidence suggest other cultures developed their own relationships with voice-based reality manipulation. The Akaviri dragon god arrived in Tamriel already understanding Dovazul, suggesting they'd encountered dragons or draconic knowledge in their homeland. Some texts hint at Akaviri techniques called kiai, shouts that combine draconic word structure with Akaviri philosophical frameworks, producing effects that Nordic tongues found alien and uncomfortable. The Red Guard sword singers supposedly achieved tonal resonance through swordsmanship rather than voice, their blades humming with Shihai essence that cut more than physical matter. Whether this connects to the Thu'um or represents parallel development remains disputed, but the conceptual similarities are striking. Both involve imposing will on reality through carefully practiced technique. Both require deep meditative understanding to master. Both produce effects that bypass conventional physical limitations. The Khajiit have oral traditions suggesting their ancestors knew a cat voice that made their words tangible, allowing speech to become physical force. Whether this refers to actual Thu'um variants or to metaphorical power of oral tradition is unclear from surviving texts, but Khajiit scholars who've studied Nordic voice techniques report unusual facility with certain shouts, particularly those involving motion and momentum, suggesting possible cultural affinity or historical connection. Even the Dwemer, with their rejection of myth and embrace of mathematics, might have understood aspects of the voice through their tonal architecture. Their machines sometimes respond to shouts in ways standard Dwemer automation doesn't explain, as if ancient engineers programmed their mechanisms to recognize and react to Dovazul as legitimate control input. This implies the Dwemer, despite their atheism and materialism, respected the Thu'um's effectiveness enough to integrate it into their technology. The broader implication is that voice-based reality manipulation might be universal possibility rather than dragon-specific ability, that consciousness and sound combine in ways that can affect existence regardless of biological origin or cultural context. The soul trap of names. One aspect of draconic culture that rarely gets discussed is their relationship with names as vulnerabilities. Dragons are incredibly guarded about their true names, specifically because names function as soul traps in draconic metaphysics. To know someone's true name is to possess a fragment of their essential being, creating a connection that can be exploited for control or harm. This is why dragons have usenames, the titles they give to others, while keeping their true designation secret. But even usenames carry power. When Alduin resurrects a dragon, he speaks its name, and that naming provides the anchor that allows the soul to recollect itself into physical form. The name isn't just an identifier, it's a binding, a commitment by reality to maintain the pattern that name describes. This has implications for the Dragonborn's own nature. Do you have a true name? A draconic designation that defines your essential being in the language of the voice? The dragons certainly seem to think so, referring to you as Dovahkiin. But is that your true name or simply a title, a usename they've collectively assigned to describe your function? Some players have noticed that certain dragons seem to recognize you before you formally met, as if they can perceive your draconic name written in your soul structure, allowing them to know what you are even when they don't know who you are. This creates interesting vulnerabilities. If you have a true draconic name, and if someone learned it, could they use it to bind or control you the way dragon priests controlled their draconic allies. Presumably, your mortal nature provides some protection, your soul not being purely draconic, and thus not fully subject to the same naming conventions. But the ambiguity remains troubling. Perhaps this is why the Greybeards give you the title Ysmir, Dragon of the North. They're not just honoring you, they're helping establish a use name, a public-facing designation that can absorb attention and speculation, protecting whatever your true draconic name might be by giving everyone something else to call you. Slow Time's perception, the Slow Time Shout, Tid Klo Ul, creates one of the most philosophically interesting effects in the voice's arsenal. When you use it, time doesn't actually slow down. It can't, not really, because time is the framework in which all change occurs. Slowing time universally would be meaningless, like trying to measure speed without reference points. Instead, slow time creates a localized bubble where causality progresses at different rates than the surrounding world, essentially establishing a pocket dimension that experiences time differently than baseline reality. You perceive and act normally, while everything outside the bubble appears slowed, because you're functioning in an accelerated temporal frame. The boundary between these frames is what produces the visible distortion effect, reality struggling to reconcile two contradictory timelines sharing the same space. This has bizarre implications. While slow time is active, you're technically not fully present in the same reality as everyone around you. You're operating in a temporal eddy, a bubble of accelerated causality that lets you interact with the normal timeline, but which exists slightly orthogonal to it. This is why enemies sometimes seem confused after slow time ends, as if they've lost track of your position. From their perspective, you didn't move quickly. You simply weren't quite there, occupying a timeline that only occasionally intersected with theirs. Some philosophers argue this means slow time is actually a partial dimensional shift, that you're briefly stepping into a parallel reality where time flows faster, performing actions there, and then returning to baseline reality with the effects of those actions persisting. If this is correct, then extensive use of slow time could have long-term consequences, your temporal position becoming increasingly misaligned with the rest of reality, potentially leading to situations where you experience time completely differently than everyone around you, even when not actively shouting. The Dragonborn might be protected from this by their dragon soul, which exists partially outside normal time anyway. But mortal tongues who attempted to learn slow time supposedly experienced disturbing effects, their perception of time becoming unreliable, minutes feeling like hours or hours passing in what felt like seconds, their consciousness increasingly disconnected from the temporal flow the rest of reality follows. The echo of Alduin. Even after defeating Alduin, his influence on the voice continues, his essence having become so deeply integrated with Skyrim's understanding of the Thu'um that completely removing his presence might be impossible. Every shout you speak carries faint traces of the World Eater's power, echoes of his original mastery of Dovazul, subtly influencing how the words function. This isn't corruption precisely, but it's not entirely neutral either. Alduin represented a particular philosophical approach to the voice, domination and consumption, his understanding of Dovazul flavored by his role as ender of cycles. When dragons use shouts, they channel their individual understanding and intent. When the Dragonborn uses shouts, They channel the collective understanding of all absorbed souls, and Alduin's shadow stretches long across that collective understanding, even if his actual soul was never absorbed. The dragon language remembers him, word walls remember him. The stones of Skyrim remember the weight of his voice, reshaping reality to serve his apocalyptic purpose. This memory persists, coloring how shouts function in subtle ways that most users never notice. But the Dragonborn, with their heightened sensitivity to the voice's nuances, might occasionally sense it. A strange feeling when certain shouts are used, as if they're speaking words that remember being spoken by something vast and hungry, words that carry faint hunger of their own. Some theorize this connection could be dangerous, that extensive use of the voice might gradually attune the Dragonborn to Alduin's particular flavor of draconic thought, slowly shifting their perspective toward the World Eater's cosmic nihilism. But others argue the opposite, that by defeating Alduin and continuing to use the voice afterward, you're reclaiming those words, overwriting his imprint with your own understanding, gradually healing the Thu'um from his influence. The question won't be answered for generations, when future scholars can look back and assess what kind of legacy your use of the voice leaves, whether your particular style of shouting bent the Thu'um toward preservation and protection, or toward something darker. Cain's gift, Cain's test. The goddess Cain supposedly gave the voice to humanity during their enslavement under dragon rule, teaching them the Thu'um so they could fight back against their oppressors. But why would she do this? Dragons are her children too, as much a part of her domain as humans or any other creature. Teaching humans to kill dragons would be like teaching your children to murder their siblings. Some theologians argue that Cain's gift wasn't about picking sides in a war, but about restoring balance. The dragons had grown tyrannical, forgotten their place in the cosmic order, and humanity's mastery of the voice was meant to remind them that power without wisdom leads to downfall. From this perspective, Cain didn't betray dragons. She corrected them, using humanity as the instrument of that correction. But other interpretations are possible. Perhaps Cain's gift was actually a test for humanity, determining whether mortals could handle godlike power responsibly. The Dragon War then becomes an examination, humanity demonstrating they could master the voice without becoming tyrannical themselves, proving their moral fitness to wield reality-altering capabilities. The fact that humans established the Greybeards and their philosophy of restraint, rather than using the voice to dominate everyone else, suggests humanity passed this test, at least partially. But the darker possibility lurks that the test isn't over, that every generation with access to the Thu'um faces the same examination. Will they use it wisely, or will they repeat the dragon's mistakes? The Dragonborn represents a unique iteration of this test. Because you have both human and draconic nature, you embody the conflict Cain's gift was meant to resolve. How you use the voice throughout your journey, whether you shout with restraint or casual abandon, whether you master the Greybeard's philosophy or ignore it entirely, these choices might carry more cosmic weight than any individual decision in any quest. You're demonstrating something to powers that watch beyond mortal understanding, proving or disproving humanity's worthiness to share the voice with dragons as equals, rather than as thieves who stole power they weren't meant to have. The future of the voice. What happens to the Thu'um after you've saved Skyrim and moved on to whatever destiny awaits Dragonborn after their heroic phase concludes? The Greybeards continue their meditation. Paarthurnax continues his vigil, but the broader cultural relationship with the voice remains uncertain. Nordic warriors witnessed the Dragonborn using shouts to defeat world-threatening dangers, which might inspire a resurgence of interest in learning the Thu'um. New generations seeking to master what their hero mastered. But learning the voice takes decades for mortals without dragon souls. And modern Nords tend toward pragmatic solutions like steel and sorcery, rather than decades-long, meditative retreats. More likely, the voice continues its slow fade into legend, remembered primarily through the Dragonborn's actions, but practiced by fewer and fewer people as the Fourth Era progresses. The dragon's fate affects this too. If most dragons were slain during your campaign against Alduin, then draconic knowledge becomes increasingly rare, word walls remaining the only teachers, and those are finite, fixed, unable to adapt or answer questions. But if significant dragon populations survived, if Paarthurnax successfully builds a new way of the voice among his kin, then dragons might become teachers again, not tyrants this time, but philosophers, sharing their understanding with carefully selected humans. This could lead to a renaissance of Thu'um study, small communities forming around individual dragons, learning not just to shout, but to think in draconic patterns, to perceive reality through dragon-influenced frameworks. The Dragonborn's legacy will largely determine which future manifests. If you use the voice responsibly, demonstrated its power while respecting its deeper nature, then future generations might approach it with appropriate caution and reverence. But if you used shouts carelessly, treated them as simple weapons without philosophical consideration, then cultural memory might encode the Thu'um as just another form of destructive magic. Interesting, but ultimately not worth the effort when fire spells and enchanted weapons provide similar results with less training. Either way, the voice will persist, its fundamental nature unchanged by human attitudes toward it. Dov Azul will continue existing as the underlying linguistic structure of reality, regardless of whether anyone speaks it. And somewhere in Skyrim's future, someone will stand before a word wall, hear the ancient chorus, and decide whether to embrace the power and responsibility of understanding the language that shapes existence itself. The last words, as the fire burns low and the northern lights drift across Skyrim's frozen sky. The mysteries of the voice linger like echoes through mountain valleys, resonant with truths we've barely begun to comprehend. Every shout spoken adds another layer to the Thu'um's living history. Every word wall discovered preserves knowledge that might otherwise fade into myth. The dragons remember when silence was impossible, when speaking meant reshaping reality, when every word carried the weight of worlds. The Greybeards remember the cost of that power, the responsibility that comes with holding the universe's attention through nothing more than voiced intention. And you, Dragonborn, stand between these memories, mortal enough to understand limitation and draconic enough to transcend it. Your voice carrying forward the accumulated understanding of an ancient art that predates the very concept of artifice. The Thu'um isn't fading because power wanes. It's fading because wisdom has grown. Because those who understand it best also understand when silence serves better than speech, when observation teaches more than command, when the most profound expression of the voice is knowing when not to use it at all. The words remain carved in stone, waiting. The knowledge persists in dragon memory, eternal. And somewhere in Skyrim's future, when the world once again requires voices that can shake mountains and reshape storms, the Thu'um will be there, patient as stone, ancient as time, ready to teach those brave or foolish enough to learn that speech is power, silence is wisdom, and understanding the difference between them is the greatest shout of all.